As Ed said earlier, we are continuing this morning our first Sunday series on the world's religions, and this morning, obviously, is Judaism. And with this Sunday, we arrive at the direct roots of our Unitarian beliefs. While we honor the richness of the world's religious traditions, it is our roots in Judaism and Christianity that have grounded our evolution as a religion. So today, as I share some comments about Judaism and some aspects of Unitarian thought, we will see how these two interacted and how Unitarian thought was shaped and influenced by Jewish thought. So Judaism emerged from the cradle of civilization, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This has been a region of the world where cultures, kingdoms, and religions emerged, were conquered, gained victory, ebbed, and sometimes disappeared. Here, Judaism emerged as the first of the Abrahamic religions, and as such, has greatly influenced both Christianity and Islam. The three religions share the same father, Abraham. These monotheistic religions are considered to be people of the book, whereas Unitarian Universalism is the people of the library. Western culture is shaped in part by the stories and teachings of the Hebrew Scriptures, or the Tanakh. The Tanakh, which Christians call the Old Testament, is divided into the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. In addition, in more modern times, meaning between the 2nd and 5th centuries, the Talmud was compiled as a collection of rabbinical writings that interpret, explain, and apply the Torah. Orthodox Jews believe that the Talmud was revealed to Moses along with the Torah and preserved in oral form until it was written down. The Talmud is thus the oral Torah, with the first 5 books of the Tanakh designated the written Torah. After the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 of the Common Era and the subsequent exile of the Jewish people, sacrifices became impossible, and Jewish life shifted and turned to a study of the Torah and prayer in the synagogue. The study of Torah and other Jewish texts has been central to the religious life of Jews ever since. A third group of Jewish literature is the Midrash, which is a large body of rabbinical material derived primarily from sermons. And the Hebrew word for sermon is darash, so midrash. The primary collections of the Midrash were compiled between the 4th and 6th centuries, but the Midrashic form continues to the present day. This continued grappling with the meaning of sacred texts has been engaging to Unitarian Universalists. For while the Tanakh is a set body of sacred text, its understandings have changed and shifted through dialogue and argument. And we know that Jews and UUs love discussion and argument. This grappling with the meaning adds over time to the understanding of the texts. In a broader sense, Unitarian Universalists have historically believed that revelation is not sealed, meaning that we not only draw inspiration from sacred texts and struggle with those sacred texts, as have Jews throughout the ages, but also we find inspiration from prophetic teachers in our own day. Judaism has given Western culture some of its foundational ethical guidelines, the Ten Commandments. There are the creation stories in Genesis, the concept of a work week and a day of rest, the Sabbath. Yet sadly, in recent decades, actually in recent centuries, the ways in which Jewish sacred texts have been interpreted by non-Jews, especially Christians, are not often in keeping with the Jewish understanding of its stories. In the ancient world, stories such as the creation of the world were not understood to be literal. They were understood as myth. Stories that, while not literal, helped give explanation to human beings for the great unanswerable questions of the human spirit. How did evil enter the world? Why is there suffering? How did we come to be? What is the meaning of life? Hebrew sacred texts not only explain the beginnings of human culture, they also help humans structure their lives. Hence, some of the writings that seem absolutely appalling to our modern ethical beliefs. In those early days, life was harsh in ways we cannot understand. Tribes structured their lives for survival. But then, over the centuries, people have sought to take sections or phrases out of Scripture, out of context, to justify injustice and abuse. We can interpret meaning from Scripture, but need to understand, as with all sacred texts, that the Hebrew Scriptures emerged from a particular time and place in history. For instance, admonitions such as not eating pork or shellfish, developed for practical health reasons. Can you imagine carrying shellfish in camel saddlebags across the desert? That wouldn't be my favorite thing for dinner. Trichinosis carried by pigs could kill people. It was easier not to eat pork. Stories of war and retribution are also part of the history of the Jewish people that are recorded in the Tanakh. And there's also some of the world's most beautiful poetry, along with some of the best and worst human love stories. Jewish scripture has been influenced by a call to action by the Jewish prophets. Perhaps one of the greatest stories in human history is the story of the Exodus. That ancient human understanding or longing that we are a stranger in a strange land, that touches most people. You know, how many of us have felt at times in our lives that we were that stranger? The Exodus story has also given strength to those who are oppressed, particularly to blacks brought to this country against their will. And that story gave people strength and courage during the Underground Railroad and the Civil Rights Movement. Another story, that of David and Goliath, has over the millennia given hope when the weak sought to struggle against what seemed like overwhelming forces. One of the aspects of Jewish faith that is particularly important to me and to a lot of you use, and I think it's a gift to the human family from Judaism, is the Jewish High Holy Days. Because I think all human beings need an annual rhythm of asking for forgiveness and offering forgiveness. We all, at one time or another, need to begin again in love. Perhaps one of the most powerful aspects of understanding how Jews see themselves is in their relationship to Yahweh. That relationship emerged out of a covenant. The Eternal One chose the Jewish people and offered a covenant with God, and that is part of the foundation of Judaism. Whatever our understanding about the outcome of that relationship of being the chosen people, there is a power to the covenants we create that bind us to one another. From that profound covenant, we human beings have learned to create covenants with one another. The covenant of marriage, for instance. When we gather as a religious community, we too covenant with one another to support, nurture, and care for each other. While Judaism is often seen as a patriarchal religion, it's interesting how the sacred feminine is there from the very beginning. The Shekinah, as I mentioned with the children, holds the feminine attributes of the sacred. And yet, even in the creation stories, we find that holy wisdom, Chokhmah in Hebrew, Sophia in Greek, holy wisdom is present from the very creation of all that is. As with all religions, Judaism over the years has divided into different sects, with rabbis interpreting scriptures in various ways. When I was serving on the Campus Ministry Association at the University of Georgia several years ago, the Hillel House at UGA shared that on Friday evening they had 4 different Shabbat services so that students could have a service that spoke to their religious tradition. One of the greatest tragedies in human history emerged, as I have shared before, but I will continue to repeat this, the tragedy of a gross mistranslation of text. Much of the anti-Semitism that Jews have suffered over the centuries emerged from a mistranslation in the New Testament, and that was that the Jews killed Jesus. That was not the case. The word, when appropriately translated, is Judean, not Jew. The Judeans were simply the people who lived in the area where Jesus lived and taught. Formal Judaism as we know it today did not exist during Jesus' time. It was the Judeans who called for Jesus to be crucified. And how many millions have died because of that error in translation? One might say that the tragedy of the Holocaust was the outcome of centuries of anti-Semitism. And while in no way I want to compare the oppression of Unitarians and Universalists to that suffered by Jews over the centuries, there have certainly been periods in history when Unitarian thought was severely repressed. Our history is filled with believers who were burned at the stake or imprisoned. Some of our Unitarians were sent to concentration camps and died there because of their beliefs. There were others more fortunate, such as Joseph Priestley, who fled to the New World, thank you Benjamin Franklin for inviting him, to escape a certain death. Imagine not having Joseph Priestley, and great scientist and minister. Many others, though, were not so lucky. While our forebears have not systematically been targeted for extinction as Jews have been, we do, I think, more than some religious traditions understand the oppression of our Jewish sisters and brothers. Today, we find new dynamic understandings of Jewish thought that are emerging with Reconstructionist and the Jewish renewal movement. Even as they emerge, we find a strengthening of Hasidic, Chabad, and the more mystical Kabbalistic Judaism that are finding new voices. At the same time, as Unitarian Universalists, we find that many Jews may consider themselves ethnic or cultural Jews, but not religious. And we are very grateful that many people of Jewish ancestry have joined our Unitarian Universalist congregations. There are even more Jews who consider themselves humanists or atheists. In talking to Will Thompson over the last couple of months, and Will has decided to convert to Judaism, and his partner Josh is a fallen away Jewish person who's an atheist. And now Will is going to rabbinical school. He's like, wait, I thought you were an atheist too. So we'll find out more fun stories about that. While modern Unitarian thought dates back only to the mid-1500s, the thread of Unitarian thought ties us to the earliest believers of the prophet Jesus. 4 decades after Jesus left this earthly plane in 70 of the Common Era, the Roman army attacked Jerusalem and destroyed the central focus of Jewish life, the temple. This was an absolutely devastating blow at the time. Jewish life was totally disrupted. Jews were no longer able to worship at the temple. And so out of this disaster emerged 2 main movements: Rabbinical Judaism, which was centered in local synagogues, and the Jewish Christian movement. There was, in those early years of Christianity, there was great diversity in the Christian movement, especially those first decades after Jesus' execution. Christian teachers taught quite different gospels and had quite different views about who Jesus was and what he said. Our Unitarian and Universalist roots emerged out of 2 different threads during that period of time. So during the latter part of the 1st century CE, the 3 largest groups within the primitive Christian movement were those who belonged to the Jewish Christian movement, the Pauline Christians, and the Essenes. But there were many others. The Jewish Christian movement, from whom we derive our understanding of Unitarian, or the unity of God, was shaped by those believers after Jesus' crucifixion. And that movement was led by James, one of Jesus' brothers. The group viewed themselves as a reform movement within Judaism, who observed the Jewish holy days, practiced circumcision of their male children, strictly followed kosher laws, and practiced the teachings of Jesus as they interpreted them to be. They are frequently today called Jewish Christians. The Jewish Christians under James included many members of those who were close to Jesus. They believed that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. They believed Jesus was a great prophet and rabbi, but not a deity. There are many references in the New Testament to conflicts between the followers of Paul and the Jewish Christians. Some theologians note that members of the Jewish Christian movement had close and lengthy association with Jesus, whereas Paul never met Jesus. In cases of conflict between the teachings of Paul and the beliefs of the James group, the Jewish Christians might more accurately reflect Jesus' original teachings. So Unitarian thought was shaped by the Jewish Christian belief in the unity of the sacred and the emphasis on Jesus as a prophet, not the only Son of God. So after the destruction of the temple, Jewish Christians were repressed, and then Roman converts to Christianity took over the early Christian movement. Those beliefs actually included many pagan beliefs that made it easier by the 4th century for the concept of the Trinity to then come into Orthodox Christianity. But after Constantine made Christianity a state religion, the threads of early Christian belief in the unity of God and of universal salvation were both repressed. So over the centuries, there have been periods in which the intellectual exploration that's so prized by both Jews and Unitarian Universalists was encouraged in society, and other times when it was repressed. And perhaps the greatest flowering of religious and intellectual discourse was in Andalusia in the last centuries of the Moorish rule in Spain. This period of religious and cultural pluralism ended in 1492 with the conquering of Spain by Ferdinand and Isabella. Then, as religious tolerance was repressed, intellectual free thinkers, Jewish, Christian, and of other persuasions fled to Eastern Europe to be under the protection of the Ottoman Empire. During this period, Jews and early believers in Unitarian thought sought to maintain their religious freedom. And of course, the high point of that was in 1568 when, with the ascension of the Transylvanian Unitarian king Sigismund. In the last decades, Jewish leaders have stood beside Unitarian Universalists as prophetic voices from both of our traditions, as both of our traditions took up admonitions reflective of the Jewish prophets of old. Together, we have called people to examine their lives and actions and to work for peace and justice. As the prophet Micah said, "And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly." And of course, the Holocaust has changed the shape of Judaism forever. In our attempt to care for survivors after World War II, our service vehicles needed a symbol. And our chalice, while tied to the martyrdom of Jan Hus in 1450, became the symbol of Unitarian Universalism after World War II. Our trucks needed a symbol that would mark our vehicles, that would be sort of similar to the Red Cross, and the flaming chalice emerged as a symbol of our service to survivors of that horrific war. Next Sunday, we honor Selma Sunday, realizing that Unitarian Universalists and Jewish leaders were among those who worked tirelessly during the Civil Rights Movement. In recent years, there have been many things that we've worked on together, and sometimes there has been tension in UU congregations as those in our congregations who grew up Jewish and Unitarian Universalists with other thoughts have struggled about what's our responsibility to relate to the state of Israel and Palestinians, So that has been a rich, sometimes painful conversation within our congregations. So what is our path as we walk into the future beside our Jewish sisters and brothers? As we move toward a more pluralistic society, both our religious traditions need to speak and act for justice and peace. Our history and our ethics demand that we don't sit by as the oppressed and the brokenhearted suffer. The emphasis we share with our Jewish sisters and brothers will continue to call each of us to examine our actions and our motivations, to call into question what it is that we must do that is right, that is just, and that emerges from our humility. Let us now rise